The large music conservatory was quiet that evening, almost too quiet. Except for the soft squeak of a mop moving across the polished wooden floor in the middle of the wide performance hall. A woman was cleaning carefully, step by step, her hands moving with experience and care. She wore a simple, dark uniform, with her sleeves rolled up and her hair tied back neatly. Most people didn't look at her when they passed by, not because they were rude, but because she had become part of the background. Like a chair or a coat rack, she worked during the evening shifts, after the students had gone home or were too busy practicing in far corners of the building. No one really asked her anything beyond good night or the lights in room 3. Please, and that was okay with her. She didn't ask for attention, she didn't seek praise. She had a job, and she did it well. That evening, the storm outside was getting worse, with rain hitting the tall windows like soft drums. Thunder rolled in the distance, but inside the hall, everything felt still. She finished wiping the floors near the stage, then walked up the small stairs to check if the piano cover had been replaced properly. It hadn't. The grand piano sat uncovered, gleaming slightly under the overhead lights. She paused for a moment, just staring at it. Her hands slowly moved toward the keys, but she didn't touch them, not yet. She looked around the empty room, heart beating a little faster. Then, quietly, she sat down on the bench. The room was silent, except for the sound of wind pressing against the windows. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. She hadn't touched a real piano in years, not since her world had changed completely. Not since she'd packed up her life and come to this country with only a suitcase and her baby daughter. But some things, like music, don't fade away easily. Her body still remembered what her mind had buried. She pressed one key softly. The sound echoed in the hall, deep and full. She closed her eyes and played another, then another, and suddenly, her fingers moved on their own. The music was slow at first, almost hesitant, like a whisper. But as the minutes passed, it grew stronger, fuller, more emotional. She played a melody she didn't know the name of because she was making it up. In that moment, it was a mixture of sadness, beauty, and something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. Each note spoke of lost dreams, of memories locked away, of moments too painful to revisit. But through the piano, she could express it all, without saying a word. She didn't notice the soft footsteps above, in the dark hallway that overlooked the performance space. The security guard, on his evening round, had stopped in his tracks. He had never heard anything like it, music that felt like it was telling a story right into his chest. He didn't want to interrupt, didn't want to make a sound. He just took out his phone and recorded a short clip. Not to go viral, but to remember this moment. This quiet, powerful moment. Down below, the woman played for a few more minutes, then slowed down. Her hands came to a gentle stop. Resting on the keys, she took a deep breath and stood up slowly. She wiped the piano gently with a soft cloth, just as she always did, then turned off the lights and quietly walked out of the hall, disappearing into the shadows once again. To anyone else, it would have been just another ordinary night. But, in that short time, something had shifted. She didn't know that someone had listened, that someone had felt every note like a wave across their chest. She had simply answered a call from the part of herself she had hidden for too long, the part that still remembered how to speak through music, even when the world had gone silent around her. And above, standing still in the hallway, the guard slowly whispered to himself, "That didn't sound like a janitor. That sounded like someone who was born to play." He looked at his phone screen, still glowing, still recording. And he smiled, not knowing that what he had captured would soon spread beyond the building, beyond the town, and touch hearts around the world. But down in the halls below, she returned to her cleaning tools, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just filled the hall with something magical. She picked up the mop again and continued cleaning the floor, just like always. not knowing the world was about to hear her play. The rain hadn't stopped, but the music inside her head wouldn't either. After that night, she tried to ignore the feeling that had awakened. She told herself it was just a moment of weakness, a slip in routine, but something had changed, even if she didn't want to admit it. For years, she had walked past that piano without stopping, but now she couldn't stop thinking about how it felt, how the keys had welcomed her fingers like old friends, how the sound had filled the empty space around her like warm air on a cold night. She still showed up to work at the same time, with the same quiet steps and calm face. She still cleaned every hallway and room without complaint. But now, her eyes would sometimes drift toward the stage whenever she passed by. Sometimes, her fingers would twitch slightly when she walked past a student playing, as if her body remembered more than she wanted it to. The music had been hiding in her all this time, quiet, waiting, patient. One evening, about a week after that night, she was wiping down the chairs in the side hall when the security guard spotted her again. He had been watching the video on his phone for the third time that day. The short recording still gave him chills, the kind of feeling that didn't fade. He hesitated, wondering if he should tell her. Then he slowly walked up to her and held out his phone. He said nothing, just tapped play. The sound of her music filled the hallway again. She froze, eyes locked on the screen. Her hands trembled as she took the phone. She listened for a moment, then quickly handed it back, shaking her head. Her voice came out soft but firm. "Please, delete it?" He looked surprised, unsure what to say. She turned back to her work and whispered, "It was just a mistake." But it wasn't a mistake. And deep down, she knew it. The problem was, that music came from a part of her she had buried. A long time ago, a part that still hurt when touched. She didn't want questions, didn't want eyes watching her. For so many years, she had worked hard to stay invisible. Not because she was ashamed, but because life had taught her that silence was safer. The next morning, the guard hesitated again, but curiosity pushed him forward. He uploaded the video with no name, no location, just a caption. "Our cleaning lady plays like she's telling a story from another world." He didn't expect much, maybe a few likes from friends, a couple of comments, but within hours, it began spreading quietly, like ripples in still water. People started asking, "Who is this? And why have we never heard her before?" They weren't just impressed, they were moved. Something about the sound reached deep places in them. Even though they didn't know who she was, in just 2 days, the video had thousands of shares. Piano teachers, music students, and even retired performers started commenting. They said things like, "She doesn't just play music, she feels it, and this brought me to tears." It reached people far from the conservatory, people she'd never meet, and still, she had no idea any of this was happening. That same evening, a professor at the conservatory saw the clip. He played it again and again, trying to figure out which student it wasn't, till he noticed the uniform. It wasn't a student. He asked around, but no one had any answers. Then someone said, "I think that's the woman who cleans the hall at night." There was silence for a moment, followed by disbelief. But the professor wasn't laughing. He was impressed, deeply impressed, and he wanted to know more. She arrived at work as usual, holding her small bag and avoiding eye contact. She walked into the staff room, put on her apron, and picked up her mop. But this time, she noticed something strange. People were looking at her, not with judgment, but with curiosity. A few students even smiled as she passed, as if they knew something she didn't. It made her uncomfortable. She moved faster, avoiding their eyes, pretending not to notice. Later that night, the professor approached her gently near the stage. He introduced himself softly and said, "I saw the video. That was you, wasn't it?" Her heart dropped. She didn't know how to answer. So she simply shook her head and walked away. She didn't want any attention. She didn't want to explain anything. She just wanted to finish her shift and disappear into the night again. But the truth was already out there. Her music had already been heard. And it was too late to erase it now. Something had been set in motion, and no matter how much she tried to stay in the shadows, the world was starting to turn its head toward her, because in just a few minutes of music, she had reached people without even trying, and no one could forget the sound of that lonely piano in the empty hall. The seasons changed slowly, and so did everything around her. The cold winds of winter softened into the warmth of spring. Flowers started blooming in the small garden near the entrance of the conservatory, and inside the building, something else had blossomed too. Her presence no longer felt like background noise. It felt like a steady rhythm, a quiet part of the place that brought people peace. She still wore the same uniform, still held the mop and cleaning cloths, but now she was also holding something more: respect, purpose, and a voice she thought was lost forever. One morning, she arrived early and walked into the music hall while the sun was still rising. The light streamed through the high windows, spilling golden colors across the stage. She stood there for a moment, looking at the piano, untouched since the night before. Without thinking, she sat down and played a soft tune, just for herself. She didn't know someone was standing at the back of the room, listening quietly with arms crossed. It was the head of the conservatory, a quiet man who rarely spoke unless it mattered. When she finished, she looked up and saw him there. He didn't clap or say much. He just nodded once and said, "The piano was waiting for you." Then he turned and walked away. That small sentence stayed with her for days. It made her realize something. She hadn't been waiting for music to return to her. Life's music had been waiting for her all those years of silence, of hiding, of working in the shadows. They were part of the path, not a mistake. They had led her back to the one place where she could be whole again. Not famous, not praised, just whole. More and more students asked for her help now. Some struggled with technique, others with confidence. But all of them saw something in her they wanted to learn. Not just skill, but honesty, feeling, and patience. She didn't try to teach like others did. She taught through small moments, by showing, by listening, by playing next to them instead of in front of them. And slowly, the conservatory started calling her more than just a helper. They called her mentor, even though she had no title. But she didn't need a title to know what she meant to them. One afternoon, a group of young students gathered in the recital hall, waiting for a scheduled guest performer to arrive. But the guest had canceled last minute due to an emergency. The hall manager looked worried. Not wanting to disappoint the students, they whispered to each other, unsure what to do. Then one of the students turned and said, "Why don't we ask her?" Everyone turned to where the woman was standing at the back, quietly wiping down the seats. At first, she shook her head, stepping back. But their eyes were hopeful, not demanding, not forcing, just full of belief. And so, with a nervous breath, she stepped forward and walked toward the piano once more. She didn't say anything as she sat down. She just placed her hands on the keys and began to play. This time, she didn't feel fear. She felt steady, like the earth beneath her feet. The students listened without moving, without blinking, because the music wasn't just notes. It was something alive. It filled the hall with warmth, like sunlight through a window. When she finished, no one clapped at first. They just sat in silence, not because they didn't like it, but because they didn't want the moment to end. Then, slowly, softly, applause rose from the room, not loud, but full of heart. She stood up, bowed gently, and smiled. This smile was different from all the others she had given before. It wasn't shy, it wasn't forced, it was peaceful. Like someone who had found her place. Later that evening, she sat with her daughter at home. Sipping tea in the small kitchen, the younger one smiled and said, "I think you changed people, you know that?" The woman looked down at her cup. Then, up at her daughter, she replied, "I think." Maybe I just reminded them of something they already had. Outside, the world went on, busy and loud. But inside that music hall, inside her heart, there was calm. She didn't become famous. She didn't go viral again. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that she was no longer afraid of being seen. She was no longer just the one who swept the floor. She was the one who made people feel, who reminded them that music is not about perfection, it's about connection. And even if she never stepped onto another big stage again, she had already left a mark, not in headlines, not in flashing lights, but in quiet hearts, in young hands learning to play. In the sound of a piano played late at night in an empty room, soft, honest, full of life, just like her. She tried to go back to her normal life, but nothing felt normal anymore. People who once walked past her without a glance were now watching her closely. Some smiled kindly, others whispered quietly when she passed. Even the way they spoke, too. Her had changed, more careful, more respectful, but to her, it didn't feel like respect. It felt like something closing in, like a door she had locked was now being pushed open from the other side. She kept her head down, cleaning every room just like always, but no matter how hard she tried to avoid it. The video had already reached places far beyond the music school. Musicians, reporters, and even talent scouts were sharing it. People online were saying things like, "Who is this hidden genius?" Or "She plays better than most trained performers." Some even claimed she was a mystery pianist on purpose, hiding her identity as part of a story. But it wasn't a story to her. It was her real life, and it was getting pulled into the light. Without her permission, the head of the music conservatory called a meeting with the faculty. Everyone was talking about her. Some teachers were amazed. Others were confused. How could someone like her play like that? One asked, no one had an answer, but they all agreed on one thing: they wanted her to play again, this time at the next student recital. Just one piece, nothing big, just enough to share her gift with a proper audience. They thought it would inspire the students, bring attention to the conservatory, and maybe even change lives. When the request finally reached her, she was standing alone in the back hallway. Wiping fingerprints from a glass door, a kind-looking woman from the staff approached her slowly. Speaking gently, she explained the offer, told her that people wanted to hear her again, and that she could choose any song. But before she finished her sentence, the woman shook her head, firmly but politely. "No, thank you," she said, quietly but clearly. The staff member tried to explain again, this time softer, but it didn't help. She simply repeated herself, then walked away before they could say more. That night, she sat on her bed at home. Staring at the small keyboard she had kept in her closet for years, she took it out sometimes just to dust it off. It didn't sound like a real piano, but it reminded her of what she used to be. She stared at the keys, her fingers resting gently on top. Unmoving, tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She just sat there, lost in thought. Her daughter came into the room quietly, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to her and sat beside her on the bed. They didn't speak for a long time, just sipped the warm tea in silence. Then her daughter spoke softly. "I heard people talking about you at school." She paused, then smiled gently. "You're kind of famous now." The woman looked down at her cup, unsure how to respond. Her daughter placed a hand over hers and said something that stayed with her. "You always told me to be brave, even when it's scary. Maybe now it's your turn." The next day, she returned to work. But something inside her felt heavier. It wasn't just the fear of being seen anymore, it was the fear of being known. She didn't want to be a story, didn't want strangers asking questions she wasn't ready to answer, and yet a small part of her wondered, what if playing again could help someone? What if the music inside her wasn't meant to stay silent forever? Late that evening, as she passed by a practice room, she heard a student struggling with a piece. The notes were clumsy, out of rhythm. Stopping and starting again, she paused at the door, then walked away, but her feet stopped just a few steps. Later, she stood still for a moment, thinking, then turned around and walked back. The student didn't notice her at first, but when she knocked gently on the doorframe, he looked up, surprised. She asked softly, "May I show you something?" He nodded, almost confused. She walked over, sat beside him, and guided his hands with hers, slowly, carefully. Within minutes, the sound changed smoother, warmer, more connected. She wasn't just correcting notes, she was showing him how to feel the music, not just play it. The student's eyes lit up as he played the passage again, this time with confidence. He looked at her in amazement. "How do you know so much?" She smiled faintly. "I used to know this world." Then she stood and left, just as quietly as she came. Word of that small moment spread quickly among the students. More of them began approaching her not just for cleaning schedules, but for advice. She never gave long lessons, just quiet guidance and gentle corrections. But the effect was powerful, and slowly, without realizing it, she was becoming a part of something again. Not just the woman who cleaned the floor, but someone who brought music back to life. Note by note, something was changing, not because she wanted fame, not because of a viral video, but because a small act of courage had opened a door. And behind that door was the sound the world didn't know it was waiting for. The hallway lights flickered as she walked slowly past the practice rooms. It had become a quiet habit. Now, after finishing her shift early, she would linger a little. Just enough to listen, not to spy or interrupt, but to feel the music again. Each note played by students reminded her of something old and familiar. She would stand in the shadows, eyes half closed, letting the sound fill her heart for a few minutes. Then she would quietly move on, returning to her mop and bucket like nothing had happened. But she didn't know the students had started noticing her. Not in a bad way, more like curiosity wrapped in respect. They had heard rumors, seen the clip, and watched from a distance as she helped one or two of them fix a passage or rhythm. She never spoke loudly, never tried to teach or act like she knew everything. But something in her presence, the way she listened, the way her hands shaped the air, felt like magic to them. One day, a student left a folded piece of paper on her cleaning cart. She opened it slowly. Inside was a note, short and honest. "Will you help me with this piece? I can't feel it when I play." At first, she stared at the note for a long time, unsure what to do. But later that evening, she found the student alone in a room, sitting in front of the piano, looking frustrated. Without a word, she walked in, sat down beside them, and nodded once. They began again, and she listened closely, then placed her fingers gently on the keys. She showed them how to breathe between phrases, how to let the silence carry emotion. The difference was instant. The sound changed, the feeling changed, and the students' eyes filled with something close to tears. More students began to reach out, leaving small notes or whispering questions as she passed. She didn't see herself as a teacher, but they did, and something inside her was changing too. She didn't feel afraid anymore, not in the same way. It wasn't about fame or attention. It was about something deeper. The music in her was finding its way out again, through other people. One night, while wiping the glass windows near the main hall, she noticed a flyer taped to the wall. It was about the upcoming recital, a yearly event where the best students performed for guests, parents, and visiting teachers. At the bottom of the list of performers, there was a new line, printed in bold, "Special guest performance to be announced." Her stomach tightened as she read those words. She had a strange feeling deep inside that this special guest might be her. Later, the same professor who had tried to speak with her before appeared again, this time more careful, more respectful. He told her the truth. They wanted her to play one short piece, just 5 minutes, that was all. He promised no pressure, no questions, just her and the piano. The stage would be hers. Only if she said yes, she didn't answer right away. She went home that night in silence, her mind full of questions she couldn't shake off. Why her? Why? Now, what if she froze? What if she made a mistake? But the biggest question of all was, what if she said no and never touched a real piano again? At home, her daughter sat at the kitchen table. Finishing homework and eating a small snack, the woman stood at the doorway. Holding on to the note the professor had given her, she didn't speak for a while, then finally asked in a quiet voice, "What would you do if you were scared to be seen?" Her daughter looked up, surprised by the question, but then gave a simple answer. "I'd still do it, even if I was scared. Because sometimes being seen helps others be brave too." That sentence stayed with her all night. She didn't sleep much, just lay in bed with her eyes open, hearing music in her head, not notes she remembered from the past, but something new, something waiting to be born. The next morning, she went to the conservatory and gave her answer. "Yes," she said, almost in a whisper. The professor didn't smile or cheer. He just nodded. Understanding the weight of her decision, he gave her a key to one of the private practice rooms and said, "Take all the time you need." That evening, for the first time in many years, she sat down in front of a real piano with no one watching. She placed her fingers gently on the keys, closed her eyes, and began to play not for others, but for herself. The music that came out was soft, unsure at first, but slowly found its voice. She played for an hour without noticing the time pass. When she finally stood up, her heart felt lighter. She wasn't afraid of the stage anymore, not because the fear was gone, but because the music inside her had grown louder than the fear. The recital was only days away, but something had already changed. She had taken the first step onto a new path, not just as a cleaner, not just as a shadow, but as a woman who once played in silence, now choosing to be heard. The days moved slowly, but the recital grew closer. She now carried the key to the private practice room in her pocket. It was small and silver, but it felt heavier than anything she'd held in years. Each night after work, she would slip inside quietly, close the door, and sit at the piano in the corner. It wasn't grand like the one in the main hall, but it was enough. She sat there for hours, letting the keys guide her. Sometimes she practiced old pieces she remembered from her past. Other times, she just played from her heart, without sheet music. Just emotion and memory, mixed together. No one told her what to perform. There were no rules. No pressure. It was her choice, and somehow that made it even harder. She didn't want to impress anyone. She just wanted to play something that meant something. Something that spoke the truth without needing words. One evening, she sat in the dark practice room long after the lights in the rest of the building had gone out. The melody she played was slow, like the sound of a story unfolding. Each note carried the weight of her past, her home, her journey, her pain, her love, and when she stopped, she sat in silence for a long time. Then she whispered to herself, "This is the one." She didn't tell anyone what she had chosen. She simply kept showing up every evening, cleaning during her shift, and then disappearing into her little music room. Some of the students would peek through the small glass window in the door. They didn't dare interrupt, but they listened, and they told others. The story of the cleaning woman who was going to play at the recital spread quietly through the school. People began to feel something different in the air, not just curiosity, but something like hope. The night before the recital, she stood in front of her mirror, holding up two different dresses. Both were simple, both secondhand, but clean and pressed. She had worn neither in years. Her daughter came into the room and looked at her. Eyes wide with excitement, she didn't say much, just gave a small nod and pointed to the dark blue one. It wasn't fancy, but it fit her well. She looked at herself and almost didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. She looked nervous, yes, but she also looked ready. That night, she barely slept. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence, but her heart beat loud and steady. Not like fear, but like a drum before something begins. She closed her eyes and imagined the stage, the bench, the keys, the lights, the faces. She let it all sit in her mind until it didn't feel so frightening anymore. Then she turned on her side and finally fell asleep. The next evening, the recital hall was filled with soft chatter. Families, students, teachers, and even a few guests from the local community had come. They took their seats and waited for this program to begin. One by one, students came on stage, playing pieces they had prepared for months. There were mistakes, of course, but also moments of beauty and passion. Each performance ended with polite applause, but everyone was waiting for the final act, the special guest that no one really knew. The name was still missing from the program sheet, but people had heard the whispers, and many had come just to see her. The woman who used to pass through unnoticed, mop in hand, now about to sit where only trained performers had sat before. Backstage, she stood near the curtains. Holding her hands together to keep them from shaking, she took slow breaths, remembering the words her daughter had told her. Sometimes, being seen helps others be brave. When her turn was called, the host didn't say her name. He simply said, "Our next and final performer is someone who reminds us that music belongs to the soul, not just the stage." She stepped out quietly, the heels of her shoes tapping gently on the wooden floor. The room fell silent the moment she appeared. There was no clapping, no sound at all, just stillness. Thick and full of expectation, she walked to the piano, sat down, and took a deep breath. Her hands hovered above the keys for just a second. Then she began to play. The music started soft, like the hush of wind through trees. It carried warmth, sadness, and something deeper truth. Each note felt like a memory. Shared without explanation, the room remained completely silent. No coughing, no rustling, no distractions, just the sound of her fingers telling a story that didn't need words. When the last note faded, she didn't move right away. She let the silence hold for a moment, as if giving the music time to settle. Then she stood up slowly, gave a small bow, and began to walk off stage. That's when the applause began, soft at first, then louder, then rising into a standing ovation. She didn't turn back to look. She simply walked behind the curtain and closed her eyes, her chest rising and falling, her heart full. She didn't need to hear the cheers to know what had just happened. She had finally let the music speak again, not for attention, not for praise, but because something inside her had found its voice again, and the world had listened. She sat in the hallway after the recital, her hands resting on her lap, still warm from the piano keys. Her heart was still beating fast, not from fear now, but from something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. The sound of clapping had faded behind the curtain, replaced by soft voices, footsteps, and quiet excitement. But she stayed where she was, staring at the floor, letting everything sink in. She had done it. She had stepped into the light, not just onto a stage, but into a part of herself that went into a part of herself that had been locked away for so long, and for the first time in years. She didn't feel like she was hiding. One of the teachers walked by, smiled gently, and placed a hand on her shoulder for just a second before moving on. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. It meant she was no longer just the woman with the mop and the quiet shoes. She had become someone people saw differently, now not above them, not below them, but beside them as she walked out of the building that night. The wind brushed against her face, cool and soft. She pulled her coat tighter around her and looked up at the sky. It wasn't raining this time. It was clear, with stars shining quietly, like they'd been watching. The whole time the next day at work felt unusual. Everywhere she went, people stopped to greet her, some with smiles, others with claps on the back. A few students even bowed slightly as she passed. In a playful but respectful way, one teacher offered her tea and asked if she would consider giving a small workshop. For beginners, another left a note in the cleaning room saying, "Thank you for reminding us what music really is." She didn't know how to respond to any of it, so she simply smiled, nodded, and kept walking. But inside, something soft and warm kept growing like a small light that had finally been lit again. That week, her daughter came home from school with a stack of printed screenshots. People from other cities had written posts about her performance. Some were music students, some were retired pianists, some were just everyday people. They had watched a video someone recorded during the recital and shared their feelings online. Many said the same thing: her music had made them cry. Not because it was sad, but because it felt real. She read those comments slowly, carefully, her fingers tracing the lines of text. Then she folded the papers and placed them gently in a box, along with the recital flyer and the dress she had worn that night. She didn't want to chase anything. She didn't want to become famous or stand on bigger stages. That wasn't her dream anymore. All she wanted was to keep the music alive, not just inside her, but around her. So when the conservatory offered her a small side role, not as a performer, but as a piano guide, she said yes. She would work with new students during her free time, helping them feel the music, not just play it. It wasn't a full teaching job, but it was something, and it meant the world to her, even though she still cleaned the floors at night. She now carried a second key on her chain, one for the storage closet, the other for the music room. Students started calling her Miss with a smile. Not because of age, but out of quiet respect, sometimes. They'd knock on the practice room and ask her to listen to a few notes. Other times, they'd leave sheet music on her cart, just in case she wanted to try something new. She never asked for any of it. But the kindness felt like pieces of herself slowly coming back together. One evening, she stayed late helping a young girl with a slow section in a classical piece. The girl was shy, barely able to look up from the keys, but with gentle guidance, her playing grew stronger, more expressive. Afterward, the girl stood up and whispered, "That's the first time I felt it, like." Inside, the woman smiled, placed a hand gently on the girl's shoulder, and replied, "That's what music is for." Weeks passed, and life returned to its quiet rhythm, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the silence of being overlooked, but the calm that comes when something broken is finally healed. She still walked the same halls, pushed the same cart, and mopped the same floors. But people saw her differently, and she saw herself differently too. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living with music in her steps, warmth in her chest, and purpose in her heart. Sometimes, at night, when the building was empty and the lights dimmed low, she would sit at the grand piano on the stage. Not to perform, not to be watched, just to play. She played quietly, as if speaking to the air itself. And in those soft moments, she knew something simple but powerful. She didn't need a spotlight to be heard. She just needed to be herself, and that was enough.